Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Soldier's Shadow. Marshall Wallace had always been a man of precision. 15 years in the Army Rangers had carved away any softness, leaving behind steel wrapped in flesh. At 38, his broad shoulders carried more than just muscle. They bore the weight of 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless classified operations, and the unshakable belief that loyalty was the only currency that mattered in this world. The transport helicopter's rotors thumped overhead as Marshall adjusted his duffel bag, watching the familiar landscape of Fort Bragg fade below. His weathered hands gripped a worn photograph, Candace holding their 4-year-old daughter Grace on her first day of preschool. Candace's auburn hair caught the sunlight, her smile radiant as she looked at their little girl. Grace, with her mother's green eyes and Marshall's stubborn chin, beamed toothlessly at the camera. "Daddy will be home soon. Baby girl," he whispered to the photo, his voice rough from months of shouting orders across desert winds. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Dick Sims. "Welcome home party at 1800. Candace has been planning for weeks. Grace can't stop talking about it." The corners of Marshall's mouth twitched upward, the closest thing to a smile he'd managed in months. Dick was a good man, a retired Marine who understood the brotherhood of service. He'd kept an eye on Marshall's family during the deployment, sending occasional updates that everything was fine. But something had been different in Candace's recent calls. Her voice carried a strange distance, and she'd been evasive about details of their daily life. When he'd asked to speak to Grace during their last video call 2 weeks ago, Candace claimed she was sleeping, though it was the middle of the day. The excuse felt hollow, but Marshall pushed down his suspicions. Deployment paranoia was common, husbands imagining problems that didn't exist. The plane touched down at Pope Army Airfield as afternoon shadows stretched across the tarmac. Marshall's mind was already racing ahead to his surprise arrival. He'd told Candace he wouldn't be home for another week, wanting to surprise both her and Grace. The image of his daughter's face lighting up when she saw him sustained him through customs and the taxi ride to his modest 2-story house in the suburbs of Fayetteville. As the cab pulled into his driveway, Marshall noticed Brian McGowan's black Escalade parked across the street. Brian was Candace's childhood friend from back in Georgia, a smooth-talking insurance salesman who'd moved to town about 6 months ago. Marshall had met him briefly before deployment at a barbecue. Something about the man's too wide smile and the way his eyes lingered on Candace had set Marshall's teeth on edge, but he dismissed it as territorial instincts. Marshall paid the driver and shouldered his duffel bag, his boots silent on the concrete walkway he'd laid with his own hands 3 summers ago. The front door was unlocked, unusual for security-conscious Candace, but perhaps she'd grown careless in his absence. The house felt different, colder. Marshall set down his bag in the entryway, noting the absence of family photos that had once lined the hallway walls. Grace's artwork was gone from the refrigerator door. The silence pressed against his eardrums like deep water. "Candace," he called softly, not wanting to startle anyone. "Grace." A muffled sound came from upstairs, a whimper that made his blood freeze. Marshall took the stairs 3 at a time, his tactical training overriding everything else. The sound came again from Grace's room, weak and broken. He pushed open the door and found his daughter curled in the corner of her bed, clutching a stuffed elephant he'd sent her from Afghanistan. But what made his world tilt off its axis was her left hand, 3 fingers missing, the stumps wrapped in gauze that was spotted with old blood. "Grace!" Marshall's voice cracked as he rushed to her bedside. Her head snapped up, green eyes wide with terror that slowly transformed into desperate hope. "Daddy?" she whispered, then louder, "Daddy." Marshall scooped her into his arms, his chest constricting as she buried her face against his shoulder. She felt too thin, too fragile, like a bird with broken wings. "Daddy, you came back," Grace sobbed against his neck. Mommy said you died screaming like a coward in battle. She said the bad men hurt you, and you couldn't save me." Each word was a knife between his ribs. Marshall forced his voice to remain steady, though fury was building like a storm in his chest. "I'm here now, baby girl. Daddy's here. Can you tell me what happened to your hand?" Grace pulled back, her small face streaked with tears. "Mommy's friend Brian. He was angry because I spilled juice on his shoes. He said I was clumsy like you, Daddy. He took me to the garage and..." She touched the bandaged stumps. "He used the big scissors from the garden. The ones for the rose bushes. Marshall's vision tinged red at the edges. Garden shears. The sick bastard had used garden shears on a 4-year-old child. His daughter. His little girl. Where's Mommy now? Marshall asked, his voice deadly quiet. She's at Brian's house. She sleeps there most nights now. She said you weren't coming back, so Brian is my new daddy. Grace's voice broke again. But I don't want a new daddy. I want you. Marshall held his daughter closer, his mind already shifting into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive through countless missions. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq. This was home. This was family. This was betrayal on a level that demanded biblical retribution. Grace, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Marshall said, pulling back to look into her eyes. Daddy is going to make sure you're never hurt again. Do you understand? She nodded solemnly, trust shining in her tear-filled eyes. Good. Now, I'm going to call Uncle Dick to come stay with you while Daddy takes care of some things. Can you be brave for just a little while longer? I've been brave for a long time, Daddy, Grace said in a voice far too old for her years. Marshall's heart shattered and reformed into something harder, colder. As he reached for his phone to call Dick, one thought echoed through his mind like a death knell. Nobody hurts my daughter and lives to tell about it. Chapter 2, Blood and Lies. Dick Sims arrived within 10 minutes of Marshall's call, his face grave and his hands shaking as he examined Grace's injuries. The old Marine's eyes met Marshall's over the child's head, and a silent communication passed between them, the kind that only happened between men who understood war. Jesus Christ, Marshall, Dick whispered as they stepped into the hallway. How long has this been going on? That's what I'm going to find out, Marshall replied, his voice carrying the cold edge of tempered steel. Can you stay with her? I have some business to handle. Dick nodded grimly. You know I will. But Marshall, what are you planning? Marshall's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm going to have a conversation with my wife. Before leaving, Marshall knelt beside Grace's bed where Dick was reading her a story. His daughter's bandaged hand rested on her stuffed elephant, and the sight sent fresh waves of rage through his system. Grace, honey, I need to ask you something important, Marshall said gently. Besides your fingers, did Brian hurt you anywhere else? Grace's face crumpled, and she nodded slowly. She pulled up her pajama shirt to reveal circular burn marks across her ribs, cigarette burns, precise and deliberate. Marshall counted 7 of them, each one a testament to calculated cruelty. He said it was punishment for being bad, Grace whispered. Mommy watched. She said I deserved it for not calling Brian Daddy. Dick Sims muttered a prayer and curse in the same breath. Marshall simply nodded, filing away each detail in the part of his mind that had been trained to remember everything, forget nothing, and plan accordingly. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Surprise party starts in 30 minutes. Candace is so excited to see you. Deanna Glass, Candace's sister. Apparently, the charade was still ongoing. Perfect. Marshall kissed Grace's forehead. Uncle Dick is going to take you somewhere safe while Daddy handles things. I promise you'll never have to see Brian again. The drive to Brian McGowan's house took 12 minutes through suburban streets lined with oak trees and white picket fences. Marshall had done his reconnaissance, of course. Before his final deployment, he'd made it his business to know everything about his family's new neighbors and acquaintances. Brian lived in a gaudy McMansion in Haymount, the kind of house that screamed new money and insecurity. Marshall parked 3 houses down and observed. Through the large front windows, he could see people moving around inside. The surprise party was indeed underway. He recognized several faces: Candace's sister Deanna, her husband Neil Campbell, and a few other family friends. They were all complicit in this fiction, all pretending that Candace wasn't a child-abusing adulteress. Marshall circled to the back of the house, moving through shadows with the practiced ease of a professional soldier. The rear sliding door was unlocked, sloppy security that would prove costly. He slipped inside through the kitchen, noting the expensive appliances and granite countertops. Whatever Brian did for a living, it paid well. Voices drifted from the front of the house. Marshall followed the sound, his boots silent on the hardwood floors. He positioned himself behind a half-wall that separated the kitchen from the living room, observing the scene like a predator studying prey. Candace stood near the fireplace, wearing a red dress Marshall had never seen before. Her auburn hair was styled differently, shorter, more sophisticated. She looked beautiful and utterly foreign to him, like a stranger wearing his wife's face. Brian McGowan had his arm around her waist with casual possessiveness, his other hand holding a beer. I still think Marshall might show up early, Deanna was saying. He always was unpredictable. He won't, Candace replied with certainty that made Marshall's jaw clench. His flight doesn't land until next Tuesday. Besides, even if he did come home early, he'd go to the house first. We'd have plenty of warning. Brian chuckled, the sound grating against Marshall's nerves. Relax, baby. Even if G.I. Joe shows up, what's he going to do? You're filing for divorce anyway. And I've already talked to my lawyer about the custody situation. What custody situation? Neil Campbell asked. Well, Grace has been having some accidents lately, Brian said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Couple of trips to the ER, some unexplained injuries. Poor kid's been real clumsy since her daddy deployed. Child services might have to get involved if the pattern continues. Marshall's hands clenched into fists. The bastard was building a paper trail, creating a narrative that would paint Grace as accident-prone while absolving himself and Candace of responsibility. It was sophisticated manipulation that spoke of experience and planning. That's terrible, Deanna said, though her tone suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Maybe Grace would be better off with a more stable father figure. Candace nodded. Brian's been wonderful with her. He's teaching her discipline and respect, things Marshall never bothered with because he was always deployed. Discipline, Marshall whispered to himself, thinking of the cigarette burns on his daughter's ribs. Brian pulled Candace closer, his hand sliding lower on her hip. The kid's got potential, but she needs a firm hand. Marshall was too soft, too permissive. That's why she's so defiant now. Defiant enough to spill juice on your new shoes, Candace laughed, and the sound was like broken glass in Marshall's ears. Kids learn fast when there are real consequences, Brian replied. Trust me, she won't make that mistake again. Marshall had heard enough. More than enough. He stepped out from behind the wall, moving into the living room with the silent grace of death itself. Well, this is cozy, Marshall said quietly. The conversation died instantly. Candace's face went white, then red, then white again. Brian McGowan's hand tightened on his beer bottle, his body tensing like a cornered animal. The other guests simply stared, their expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to fear. Marshall, Candace gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. You're early. Surprise, Marshall said, his voice carrying no warmth whatsoever. His eyes moved from person to person, cataloging their reactions, their positions, their potential threat levels. Old habits from dangerous places. Brian stepped forward, still maintaining his arm around Candace. Hey there, soldier boy. Welcome home. We were just celebrating, Marshall finished. I can see that. Tell me, Brian, how long have you been fucking my wife? The vulgarity hit the room like a physical blow. Deanna gasped. Neil choked on his drink. Brian's face darkened with anger and something else, fear, maybe, or calculation. Now look here, buddy, Brian started, his voice taking on an aggressive edge. You can't just. 8 months, Candace interrupted, her chin lifting defiantly. It's been 8 months, Marshall. And I'm not sorry. The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Marshall nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed a weather report. 8 months, he repeated. That's interesting timing. That's about when Grace started having her accidents. Brian's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Marshall took a step closer, his posture relaxed but radiating lethal potential. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Fact 1. My daughter is missing 3 fingers. Fact 2. She has 7 cigarette burns on her torso. Fact 3. She told me exactly how she got those injuries and who gave them to her. The room went silent except for the tick of an expensive grandfather clock. Brian's face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, cold determination. You always were a paranoid bastard, Brian said finally. That kid's been telling stories since day one. She's disturbed, Marshall, probably from having an abusive father who's never home. Abusive father, Marshall repeated thoughtfully. Is that the story you're going with? Candace stepped forward, her voice shaking with either fear or rage. Marshall, you need to leave. This is Brian's house, and you're not welcome here. Marshall's smile was a terrible thing to behold. You're absolutely right, Candace. This is Brian's house, And you're absolutely right that I'm not welcome here. He paused, letting the moment stretch. The thing is, I'm not leaving without having a complete conversation about my daughter's injuries. All of them. In detail. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Brian must have heard it because his hand moved slightly toward his waistband, a tell that suggested he was carrying concealed. I think this party's over, Brian said carefully. Maybe everyone should head home, and we can sort this out later when emotions aren't running so high. Emotions? Marshall's laugh was like breaking bone. Brother, you haven't seen my emotions yet. But you're going to. He turned to address the room. Deanna, Neil, everyone else. You have exactly 60 seconds to leave this house. What happens after that is between me, my wife, and the man who mutilated my daughter. Nobody moved for a heartbeat. Then Deanna grabbed her purse. Marshall, please don't do anything you'll regret. Oh, I won't regret anything, Marshall replied without taking his eyes off Brian. But I can't say the same for everyone else. The guests filed out quickly, leaving only Marshall, Candace, and Brian in the suddenly cavernous living room. Outside, car engines started and disappeared into the night. Now then, Marshall said pleasantly, let's talk about consequences. Chapter 3, The Art of War. The silence in Brian McGowan's living room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Marshall stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, while Brian and Candace positioned themselves near the fireplace like cornered animals seeking the protection of numbers. Marshall, let me explain, Candace began, her voice taking on the pleading tone she used to use when caught in small lies. Forgotten anniversaries, minor purchases, harmless deceptions that seemed quaint now compared to this betrayal. Explain what exactly? Marshall asked, his tone conversational. Explain how you let your boyfriend torture our 4-year-old daughter? Explain how you told her I was dead? Or explain how you've been collecting my death benefits while I was dodging IEDs in Afghanistan? Brian's hand inched closer to his waistband again. Marshall tracked the movement with peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact with his wife. I never meant for Grace to get hurt, Candace said, tears starting to flow. Brian was just trying to discipline her, and she was being so difficult. Stop. Marshall's voice cut through her words like a blade. Stop talking. Right now. The absolute authority in his tone, honed by years of commanding men in life or death situations, had an immediate effect. Candace's mouth snapped shut, her eyes wide with a fear she'd never seen before in her husband. Marshall pulled out his phone and held it up so both of them could see the screen. I've been recording this conversation since I walked in. Every word, every confession, every admission of child abuse. It's already uploaded to a secure server and copied to 3 different law enforcement agencies. Brian's face went ashen. That's not legal. You can't record people without. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, Marshall replied calmly. I can record any conversation I'm part of. And since this conversation involves the systematic abuse of my daughter, I imagine the authorities will be very interested in the details. Candace sank into a chair, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. Marshall, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can. Counseling. Marshall's laugh was devoid of humor. Candace, you watched a man cut off your daughter's fingers with garden shears. You participated in burning her with cigarettes. You told her I was dead to break her spirit. There is no working this out. Brian finally made his move, reaching for the gun at his waistband with practiced speed. But Marshall had been waiting for it. Before Brian's fingers could close around the grip, Marshall was moving. 15 years of hand-to-hand combat training compressed into 3 seconds of fluid violence. Marshall's left hand captured Brian's wrist while his right drove an elbow into the man's solar plexus. Brian folded forward, gasping, and Marshall relieved him of his weapon, a Glock 19 with 1 round chambered. Glock 19, Marshall observed, checking the weapon with professional efficiency. Good choice. Reliable, simple, effective. He ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and tossed the pieces in different directions. Of course, it's only effective if you can actually draw it. Brian was on his knees, clutching his chest, and struggling to breathe. Candace had pressed herself back into the chair as if she could disappear into the upholstery. Here's what's going to happen, Marshall said, his voice taking on the calm, measured tone he used for mission briefings. Candace, you're going to pack a single bag and leave this house tonight. You will not contact Grace, You will not come near our home, and you will not attempt to interfere with the divorce proceedings. Marshall, she's my daughter too. No. The word hit like a physical blow. Mothers don't watch their children get tortured. Mothers don't participate in abuse. You forfeited any claim to that title the moment you chose this piece of shit over your own child. Marshall turned his attention to Brian, who had managed to get back to his feet but was still wheezing. And you're going to disappear. Tonight. Permanently. You can't threaten me, Brian gasped. I'll call the police, You'll do nothing, Marshall interrupted. Because if you stay in this state, if you ever come within 100 miles of my daughter again, I will hunt you down and make you wish you died in your sleep. The promise in his voice was absolute, and Brian seemed to recognize it. His face cycled through bravado, calculation, and finally, pure fear. Marshall reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a GPS tracker no bigger than a coin. This is military-grade surveillance equipment. Completely undetectable, completely untraceable, and completely effective at ranges up to 50 miles. I have 6 more just like it. He tossed the tracker to Brian, who caught it reflexively. That's your parole officer, Marshall continued. If it ever stops moving away from North Carolina, if it ever comes back toward my family, I'll know. And I'll come for you. This is insane, Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't what? Protect my daughter? Ensure her safety? You seem to be under the impression that normal rules apply here. They don't. Marshall's smile was arctic. I've spent 15 years learning how to hunt, capture, and eliminate threats to national security. You're just another target. Candace found her voice again. Marshall, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about Grace. She needs stability. She needs to never see either of you again, Marshall said flatly. She needs therapy, medical attention, and time to heal from the trauma you both inflicted on her. What she doesn't need is parents who think garden shears are appropriate disciplinary tools. Marshall pulled out his phone again and showed them a new screen. I've been busy while we've been talking. Child Protective Services has been notified. The FBI has been notified. Child abuse across state lines becomes a federal matter when one parent is military. The JAG Corps has been notified because this affects my security clearance and deployment status. He swiped to another screen. Your sister Deanna received a very interesting package about 10 minutes ago, Candace. Photos of Grace's injuries, audio recordings of tonight's confessions, and a detailed timeline of events. She's probably calling your mother right about now. Candace's face crumpled. Her family's opinion mattered more to her than almost anything else. It was her greatest weakness and had always been the source of her need for approval and status. Brian's insurance agency received a similar package, Marshall continued. Amazing how quickly word spreads in small communities. I imagine his business will be quite interesting over the next few weeks. Brian's face had gone from pale to green. His insurance business depended entirely on reputation and trust, commodities that evaporated quickly when child abuse accusations surfaced. You want to destroy us, Brian said. No, Marshall replied. I want to protect my daughter. Destroying you is just a pleasant side effect. Marshall walked to the front window and peered through the blinds. You have 30 minutes to pack whatever you can fit in your car, Brian. After that, I start making phone calls to people who are much less reasonable than I am. What people? Candace asked. Marshall's smile was genuinely terrifying. Did you know that 3 of my army buddies live within driving distance of here? Jake Krause runs a private security firm in Raleigh. Ralph Best works for a company that specializes in asset recovery, legal and otherwise. Derek Schultz just got out of the Corps and is looking for freelance work. He paused to let that sink in. These are men who've spent years in places where justice is measured in brass casings and body bags. They have very specific skill sets, and they're extremely loyal to their friends' families, especially when those families include injured children. Brian was already moving toward the stairs, his survival instincts finally overriding his pride. Candace remained frozen in the chair, tears streaming down her face. Marshall, please, she whispered. I know I made mistakes, but Grace is still my baby. I love her. Marshall knelt down beside her chair, his voice gentle for the first time that evening. Candace, I know you think you love her, but love doesn't burn children with cigarettes. Love doesn't cut off fingers. Love doesn't choose abusive boyfriends over innocent daughters. He stood up, his expression hardening again. You had 8 months to choose Grace. 8 months to protect her, to leave Brian, to be a mother. Instead, you chose to participate in her torture. That choice has consequences. Sounds of frantic packing came from upstairs. Marshall checked his watch. Brian was efficient when motivated by fear. Good. Efficiency would make this transition smoother for everyone. What happens now? Candace asked. Now you both disappear from our lives, Marshall said simply. Grace gets the therapy and medical attention she needs. I file for divorce and full custody, and we all move on with our lives. And if we don't disappear? Marshall's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Candace shrink back into the chair. Then I stop being reasonable, he said. And trust me, Candace, you really don't want to see what unreasonable looks like. Chapter 4, Ghosts and Shadows. 3 days after the confrontation at Brian's house, Marshall sat in the sterile waiting room of Cape Fear Valley Health System while Grace underwent her 3rd medical examination. The doctors wanted to document everything: the missing fingers, the cigarette burns, the psychological trauma. Each examination was necessary, but felt like another violation of his daughter's innocence. Dr. Patricia Cahill, a pediatric surgeon with kind eyes and steady hands, emerged from the examination room and took the seat beside Marshall. The damage to Grace's fingers was precise, she said carefully. Whoever did this knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum trauma while avoiding major blood vessels. It's not the work of someone acting in rage. Marshall's jaw tightened. Premeditated. That would be my assessment, yes. The burns are also strategically placed, hidden by clothing, designed to cause pain without visible scarring. This speaks to someone with experience in causing controlled trauma. Dr. Cahill handed Marshall a folder. I've documented everything for the legal proceedings. But Marshall, I need you to understand. Grace is going to need extensive therapy. The physical wounds will heal, but the psychological damage, that's going to take time. How much time? Years, probably. And that's with professional help and a stable environment. Children this young who experience deliberate cruelty from parental figures. It fundamentally changes how they view the world. Marshall studied the medical photos in the folder, each image burning itself into his memory. Grace's small hands, her scarred torso, the haunted look in her eyes during the examination. Evidence of systematic cruelty that would fuel his rage for the rest of his life. There's something else, Dr. Cahill continued. During our psychological evaluation, Grace mentioned other incidents. Things that happened when you were deployed, but before the finger incident. I think this abuse has been escalating for months. What kind of incidents? Isolation, being locked in closets or the basement for hours. Food deprivation, being sent to bed without meals as punishment for minor infractions. Emotional manipulation, being told you were dead, that you abandoned her, that she was worthless. Each revelation hit Marshall like a physical blow. While he'd been serving his country, trusting his wife to protect their daughter, Grace had been living in a nightmare that escalated gradually until it culminated in mutilation. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Dick Sims. Package delivered as requested. Video confirms receipt. Marshall had asked Dick to deliver copies of the evidence to several key people, not just authorities, but community members who needed to know the truth before Candace and Brian could craft their own narrative. Dr. Cahill, I need to ask you something, Marshall said. How common is this kind of systematic abuse? More common than we'd like to admit. Usually, it involves a custodial parent and a romantic partner who views the child as competition or an obstacle. The abuse serves 2 purposes: controlling the child and demonstrating power over the custodial parent. So Brian was asserting dominance over both Grace and Candace. That would be consistent with the patterns we see. The question is why your wife participated instead of protecting Grace. Marshall had been wondering the same thing. The Candace he'd married 8 years ago had been nurturing, protective, fiercely maternal. The woman who'd watched Brian mutilate their daughter was someone else entirely, or perhaps someone who'd always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Jake Krause, one of the army buddies he'd mentioned to Brian. Marshall stepped outside to take the call. Marshall, I got your message. Jake's voice was tight with controlled anger. Please tell me you didn't actually let that piece of shit just walk away. He's gone. Left town the same night I confronted him. Gone where? According to the tracker I put on his car, he's in South Carolina. Seems to be heading for Florida. And the wife? Candace is staying with her sister in Wilmington. She's been in contact with a divorce attorney, but she hasn't tried to see Grace or interfere with the custody situation. Jake was quiet for a moment. You know, Marshall, there are ways to ensure they never become a problem again. Permanent ways. The offer hung in the air between them. Marshall had known Jake for 12 years, had served with him in Afghanistan. Jake was a man of action, someone who believed problems should be solved definitively. His private security firm employed a lot of former military personnel who shared that philosophy. I appreciate the offer, Marshall said carefully. But I've got this handled. You sure? Because if that motherfucker ever comes back, if he ever even thinks about your little girl again, then I'll handle it myself, Marshall finished. But Jake, I might need some technical assistance with the surveillance situation. Legal assistance. Whatever you need. Ralph Best has connections in the legal community, and Derek Schultz runs a pretty sophisticated monitoring operation. We can keep eyes on both of them indefinitely. After ending the call, Marshall walked back into the hospital to find Grace sitting in the waiting room with a child psychologist named Jessica Dixon. Grace was drawing pictures with her uninjured hand, dark, disturbing images that spoke to the chaos in her young mind. Daddy, Grace called when she saw him. Dr. Jessica says I can draw about my feelings. But my pictures keep being scary. Marshall knelt beside her chair and examined the drawings. One showed a stick figure in a garage, surrounded by larger figures with sharp objects. Another depicted a house with windows like eyes and a door like a screaming mouth. The third was simply black scribbles covering the entire page. It's okay to draw scary pictures, Dr. Dixon explained. Art therapy helps children process trauma. Grace is expressing her feelings in a healthy way. Marshall studied his daughter's face, still beautiful despite the trauma, still innocent despite everything she'd endured. Grace, honey, do you remember the stories Daddy used to tell you about brave knights who protected people from monsters? Grace nodded solemnly. Well, Daddy is a kind of knight, and my job is to make sure the monsters can never hurt you again. Do you believe that? Yes, Daddy. But what if the monsters come back? Marshall's expression hardened. Then Daddy will do what knights do to monsters. Dr. Dixon raised an eyebrow at the exchange, but Marshall didn't care. His daughter needed to feel safe, and the only way to ensure her safety was to demonstrate that threats would be met with overwhelming force. That evening, after settling Grace at Dick Sims' house for another night, Marshall returned to his own home for the first time since discovering her injuries. The house felt hollow, contaminated by the knowledge of what had happened here while he was away. He walked through each room methodically, gathering evidence of Candace's betrayal and Grace's suffering. In Grace's room, he found the first aid supplies that had been used to treat her injuries: gauze, antiseptic, pain medication, all hidden in a shoebox under her bed, suggesting that her injuries had been deliberately concealed. In the master bedroom, Marshall discovered evidence of Brian's extended presence: men's clothing, toiletries, even a spare key to his Escalade. The level of comfort and presumption was staggering. Brian hadn't just been having an affair with Candace. He'd been living in Marshall's house, sleeping in Marshall's bed, and torturing Marshall's daughter. Marshall's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously. Sergeant Wallace? This is Agent Andrea Sampson with the FBI. I understand you've reported a case of child abuse with federal implications. That's correct. I'd like to schedule an interview with you and your daughter. We'll need to review all the evidence and determine how to proceed with charges. Marshall felt a grim satisfaction. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, but they moved slowly. His own wheels turned much faster. Agent Sampson, I should mention that the primary perpetrator has fled the state. I believe he's currently in Florida. We'll handle the apprehension, Sergeant. In the meantime, I need you to promise me that you won't take any action against the suspects on your own. Marshall was quiet for a long moment. I promise I won't do anything illegal. It wasn't exactly the promise Agent Sampson had requested, but it was the only one Marshall could make in good conscience. Because while he wouldn't break any laws, he would absolutely use every legal means at his disposal to ensure Brian McGowan and Candace Wallace never threatened his daughter again. And if they did try to return, if they did attempt to hurt Grace again, well, there were plenty of legal ways to neutralize threats. Marshall just had to be creative about it. As he hung up the phone, Marshall began planning. Phase 1, documentation and legal proceedings, was underway. Phase 2 would require more finesse, more patience, and the kind of strategic thinking that had kept him alive in 3 combat deployments. Brian McGowan and Candace Wallace thought they could disappear into new lives, leaving Grace's trauma behind them like an unpleasant memory. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Marshall Wallace never forgot an enemy, and he never forgave a threat to his family. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Patience. 2 weeks after Candace and Brian's departure, Marshall sat in the office of his attorney, Lloyd Clark, reviewing divorce papers that read like a military operation, precise, comprehensive, and designed to achieve total victory. Lloyd was a former JAG officer who understood both the legal complexities and the emotional stakes involved in cases like this. "I've never seen documentation this thorough," Lloyd said, spreading the evidence across his mahogany desk. Medical records, audio recordings, video confessions, witness statements, FBI reports. "Marshall, you've built a case that would convict them both in criminal court, let alone family court." "I want complete custody," Marshall replied. "Full parental rights, no visitation for Candace, and a restraining order that covers Grace, me, and any future family we might have." "Any future family?" Marshall's expression darkened. "I want to make sure that if I remarry, if Grace has a stepmother or siblings, they're protected from any retaliation attempts." Lloyd nodded grimly. "Understood. What about the property division? Candace can have half the house value and half our savings account. I want everything else, Grace's college fund, my military benefits, the vehicles, all personal property." "That's generous considering the circumstances." "It's strategic," Marshall corrected. "I want this divorce to move quickly and quietly. The longer it drags out, the more opportunities they have to cause problems. Besides, money doesn't matter. Grace matters." Lloyd's phone rang, and he answered with a frown. "Yes, put her through." He looked at Marshall. "It's Candace's attorney. They want to negotiate custody arrangements." Marshall's smile was sharp. "Tell them we'll accept their unconditional surrender. Otherwise, we'll see them in court." While Lloyd handled the call, Marshall reviewed updates from his surveillance network. Jake Krause had been true to his word. Brian McGowan was being monitored 24/7 by a rotation of private investigators with military backgrounds. The reports made for interesting reading. Brian had driven straight to Tampa, Florida, where he'd checked into a cheap motel under a false name. He'd made contact with someone named Mario Cotton, apparently an old associate who ran a small-time loan sharking operation. Brian was trying to establish himself in Florida, probably planning to start over with a new identity and a new business. What Brian didn't know was that Mario Cotton was already under FBI surveillance for federal racketeering charges. Brian's association with him would automatically flag him for additional scrutiny, a fact that Marshall had ensured reached the right people through carefully anonymous tips. Candace, meanwhile, was staying with her sister Deanna in Wilmington, but the family dynamics were deteriorating rapidly. Marshall's distribution of evidence had created a firestorm in the Glass family. Candace's mother, Alma Lindsay, had disowned her entirely after seeing the photos of Grace's injuries. Her father had threatened to file assault charges himself if Candace ever contacted them again. The social isolation was exactly what Marshall had hoped for. Without family support or financial resources, Candace was becoming increasingly desperate and unstable. Desperate people made mistakes. Unstable people made bigger mistakes. Lloyd finished his call and returned to the documents. Candace's attorney is claiming temporary insanity, emotional breakdown, manipulation by Brian McGowan. They want supervised visitation and joint custody. What did you tell them? I told them that Grace was mutilated by a man Candace invited into our client's home, and that Candace participated in the abuse. I suggested they focus on keeping their client out of prison rather than negotiating custody. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Dick Sims. Grace asking about mommy again. How do I handle it? Marshall texted back. Tell her mommy is sick and needs to get better before she can see Grace again. It's not a lie. The truth was more complicated. Grace was indeed asking about Candace with increasing frequency, but her questions were conflicted. She wanted to see her mother, but she was also terrified of being hurt again. Dr. Jessica Dixon had explained that this was normal for abused children. Love and fear often coexisted in relationships with abusive caregivers. Lloyd, I need you to file one additional motion, Marshall said. I want Candace ordered to undergo a complete psychological evaluation before she's allowed any contact with Grace. And I want Brian McGowan added to the restraining order even though he's not Grace's biological father. On what grounds? He was acting in a parental capacity while living in my home. He inflicted the actual physical abuse. And he represents an ongoing threat to Grace's safety. Lloyd made notes on his legal pad. I can argue that. It's unusual, but given the circumstances, a judge might allow it. Marshall's phone rang. Agent Andrea Sampson from the FBI. Sergeant Wallace, I have an update on your case. We've located Brian McGowan in Tampa, and local authorities are coordinating with us on an arrest. We're also pursuing federal charges against your wife for conspiracy and failure to report child abuse. When will the arrests happen? McGowan should be in custody within 48 hours. Your wife? That's more complicated. Her attorney is negotiating a surrender, and they're asking for a plea deal. Marshall felt cold satisfaction flowing through his veins. What kind of plea deal? Guilty plea to child endangerment in exchange for suspended sentence and supervised probation. No jail time, but permanent loss of parental rights and registration as a child abuse offender. It was more than Marshall had dared hope for. Candace would lose Grace forever, legally and permanently. She'd also be marked for life as a child abuser, making it nearly impossible for her to work with children or present herself as a victim in future relationships. What about Brian? He's looking at federal charges for child abuse across state lines. With his criminal history, he's facing 8 to 12 years in federal prison. Criminal history? You didn't know? Brian McGowan has prior convictions for domestic violence in Georgia and South Carolina. He served 18 months for aggravated assault against a former girlfriend in 2019. Your wife chose a professional abuser as your daughter's caretaker. The revelation hit Marshall like cold water. Candace hadn't just made a mistake or fallen under Brian's influence. She'd knowingly brought a violent criminal into their home and given him access to Grace. The betrayal was even more calculated than he'd realized. After ending the call, Marshall sat in Lloyd's office processing this new information. Everything made more sense now. Brian's precise knowledge of how to inflict maximum trauma, his systematic escalation of abuse, his confident manipulation of both Candace and the medical system. These were the actions of someone with experience. Marshall, Lloyd's voice brought him back to the present. What did the FBI say? Brian's going to prison. Candace is going to lose Grace permanently. Marshall's voice was flat, emotionless. Everything's proceeding according to plan. But even as he said it, Marshall knew this wasn't the end. Prison sentences could be appealed, reduced, or commuted. Restraining orders could be violated. Desperate people sometimes did desperate things, especially when they had nothing left to lose. Marshall had protected Grace from immediate harm and ensured legal consequences for her abusers. But true protection required more than legal documents and prison sentences. It required the kind of vigilance and preparation that Marshall had learned in much more dangerous places. As he left Lloyd's office, Marshall made a mental note to call Jake Krause again. The surveillance network would need to be permanent, not temporary. And there were other preparations to make: security systems for their new home, self-defense training for Grace when she was older, contingency plans for every possible threat scenario. Brian McGowan and Candace Wallace would learn that destroying Marshall's family had consequences that extended far beyond courtrooms and prison cells. They would learn that some enemies never stopped hunting, never stopped watching, and never forgot. Marshall Wallace was a patient man, but patience wasn't the same thing as forgiveness. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. Marshall stood in the kitchen of his new house, watching Grace color at the breakfast table while sunlight streamed through bulletproof windows. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Brian's house, and life had settled into a careful routine designed around security and healing. The house itself was a fortress disguised as a suburban home. Jake Krause's security firm had installed state-of-the-art surveillance cameras, motion sensors, and an alarm system that connected directly to both local police and Jake's rapid response team. The doors were reinforced steel, the windows were ballistic glass, and the safe room in the basement could withstand everything short of military-grade explosives. "Daddy, look," Grace said, holding up her latest drawing. Her art therapy had progressed significantly. The images were still sometimes dark, but they now included bright colors and hopeful elements. This particular drawing showed a castle with a brave knight protecting a princess from a dragon. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Marshall said, noting that Grace was using her prosthetic fingers more naturally. The medical team at Duke University had fitted her with state-of-the-art prosthetics that gave her almost full dexterity. "Tell me about the story." "The knight loves the princess very much, so he fights all the monsters that want to hurt her. And when he wins, they live in the safe castle forever." Marshall smiled genuinely for the first time in months. Grace was healing, slowly but steadily. The nightmares were less frequent, her appetite had returned, and she was learning to trust again. Dr. Jessica Dixon called it remarkable progress for a child who'd endured such systematic trauma. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Ralph Best. "Package incoming. ETA 20 minutes. Marshall had been expecting this contact for weeks. Brian McGowan had been released from federal prison 2 months early due to overcrowding and good behavior, a development that had triggered every alarm in Marshall's security network. The GPS tracker was long dead, but Jake's surveillance team had picked up Brian's trail the moment he crossed into North Carolina. Apparently, Brian hadn't learned his lesson about staying away from Marshall's family. "Grace, honey, Uncle Dick is going to come over and watch movies with you while Daddy handles some business." Grace looked up from her coloring, her green eyes alert. "Is it about the monsters?" Marshall knelt beside her chair. "Maybe, but remember what we practiced. If anything scary happens, I go to the safe room and push the red button. Uncle Dick will stay with me until you come back." "That's my brave girl." Dick Sims arrived within 10 minutes, armed and alert despite his casual demeanor. Marshall had briefed him on the situation, and the old Marine was ready for anything. As Grace showed Dick her drawings, Marshall retreated to his home office to prepare for what was coming. Ralph Best's intelligence package arrived exactly on schedule, detailed surveillance reports on Brian McGowan's activities since his release. The information was disturbing, but not surprising. Brian had spent his first week of freedom tracking down Candace in Wilmington. She'd been working as a waitress at a truck stop diner, living in a studio apartment above a bail bondsman's office. Her family had maintained their disownment, her divorce settlement had been minimal, and her criminal record made decent employment nearly impossible. Brian had convinced Candace to help him with a plan for getting Grace back. The plan was sophisticated and showed Brian's criminal experience. They would claim that Marshall was suffering from PTSD and had become violent and unstable. They had fabricated evidence of erratic behavior, forged medical documents suggesting psychological breakdown, and even recruited false witnesses willing to testify about Marshall's supposed threats and intimidation. Their endgame was to petition for emergency custody, claiming that Grace was in immediate danger from her father's military-induced psychosis. It was a clever strategy that exploited common biases about combat veterans while painting themselves as concerned parents trying to rescue an endangered child. What Brian and Candace didn't know was that their entire plan had been monitored from day one. Every phone call, every meeting, every forged document had been recorded by Jake's surveillance team. They had unwittingly created a detailed record of conspiracy, perjury, and attempted fraud. Marshall's phone rang. Jake Krause's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "They're moving, Marshall. Brian and Candace just left Wilmington in a rental car. They've got a court order based on their fabricated evidence, and they're heading your way with a deputy sheriff who thinks he's serving a legitimate emergency custody petition." "How long do I have?" 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. The deputy's name is Hubert Nash. He's clean, just doing his job based on false information. But Brian's carrying a gun, and Candace has a taser. They're planning to take Grace by force if necessary. Marshall felt familiar calm descending over him, the ice-cold clarity that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. "Are you positioned?" "My team's in place. Ralph's got the legal documentation ready. Derek's coordinating with FBI agent Sampson. Everything's set." "Good. Let them come." Marshall spent the next hour making final preparations. He moved Grace and Dick to the safe room, activated all security systems, and reviewed the legal documents that would destroy Brian and Candace's final gambit. Then he settled into his living room to wait, a cup of coffee growing cold on the table beside him. The doorbell rang at exactly 3:47 p.m. Marshall opened the door to find Deputy Hubert Nash, a young man with earnest eyes and carefully pressed uniform, flanked by Brian McGowan and Candace Wallace. Brian looked leaner and harder after his time in prison, while Candace appeared haggard and desperate. "Sergeant Wallace?" Deputy Nash said formally. "I have a court order for emergency custody transfer of Grace Wallace. I need to see the child immediately." Marshall examined the court order, a masterpiece of legal forgery that would have convinced most people. "This is quite a document, Deputy Nash. May I ask who provided the evidence for this emergency order?" "The child's mother and stepfather reported concerns about your mental state and your fitness as a parent. They have medical documentation and witness statements." "Stepfather?" Marshall's gaze shifted to Brian. "I wasn't aware that my daughter had acquired a stepfather." Brian stepped forward, his confidence returning. "Candace and I were married last week. Grace is legally my stepdaughter now, and we have serious concerns about her safety in this environment." Marshall nodded thoughtfully. "Congratulations on the marriage. May I see the marriage certificate?" Brian produced a document that looked official but wouldn't survive close scrutiny. Marshall pretended to examine it while actually triggering a silent alarm that would bring Jake's team into position. "There seems to be a problem with your documentation," Marshall said calmly. "What kind of problem?" Deputy Nash asked. "Well, for starters, Candace is already married. To me. Our divorce was never finalized because she fled the state before the proceedings concluded. That makes this marriage certificate fraudulent." Marshall produced his own legal documents, genuine court orders showing that the divorce was still pending, that he retained full custody of Grace, and that both Brian and Candace were subject to restraining orders that prohibited them from coming within 500 yards of his property. Deputy Nash examined the conflicting paperwork with growing confusion. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify these documents with the court." "Of course," Marshall said. "But I should mention that both of these individuals are wanted on federal warrants for child abuse, conspiracy, and now apparently fraud and perjury." Brian's hand moved toward his waistband, but Marshall was ready. "I wouldn't do that, Brian. You're already looking at federal charges. Adding assault on a federal witness and threatening a law enforcement officer won't improve your situation." At that moment, Jake Krause and his team emerged from concealment, weapons drawn and professionally positioned. FBI agent Andrea Sampson appeared from around the corner of the house, her badge clearly visible. "Brian McGowan, Candace Wallace, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, violating federal restraining orders, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping," Agent Sampson announced. Deputy Nash stepped back, his hand on his radio. "Federal agents, this is Deputy Nash with Cumberland County. I need supervisory assistance at this location." The arrest proceeded with efficient professionalism. Brian maintained his defiance until the handcuffs clicked shut, then his shoulders sagged in defeat. Candace broke down completely, sobbing about how she just wanted to see her daughter. "Agent Sampson," Marshall said as the arrest concluded, "I assume this concludes their ability to threaten my family?" Between the new charges and the violations of their existing plea agreements, they're both looking at significant federal prison time. Brian will likely serve 8 to 12 years. Candace, probably 4 to 6. Marshall nodded with grim satisfaction. "And the restraining orders will be permanent. Permanent and enforceable across all 50 states. Even after they're released, any contact with you or Grace will result in immediate arrest." As the law enforcement vehicles disappeared down his street, Marshall returned to the safe room where Grace and Dick were waiting. Grace looked up from her coloring book with worried eyes. "Are the monsters gone, Daddy?" Marshall knelt beside her and pulled her into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart. The monsters are gone forever. Promise. I promise. Daddy made sure they can never hurt you again." As Grace returned to her drawing, Marshall reflected on the 6 months of careful planning that had led to this moment. Brian and Candace had walked into a trap that was months in the making, constructed from their own desperation and criminal behavior. They had thought they could outmaneuver a man who'd spent 15 years planning military operations against much more dangerous enemies. They had underestimated the resources, intelligence, and determination of someone protecting his family. Most importantly, they had forgotten that Marshall Wallace never forgave. And he never forgot. The war was over. Marshall had won completely and permanently. Grace was safe, the threats were neutralized, and justice had been served. Now they could finally begin the process of building a new life together, one where Grace could grow up without fear, where she could trust that her father would always protect her, and where the monsters would never return. Chapter 7. Absolute Victory. 1 year later, Marshall stood on the back deck of his new house, watching Grace play in their securely fenced backyard with their new dog, a German shepherd named Atlas who'd been trained as both a companion and a guardian. Grace's laughter echoed across the yard as Atlas gently caught a frisbee in his mouth, his protective instincts perfectly balanced with his playful nature. The house in Fayetteville had been sold, and the proceeds used to purchase this property in the mountains near Asheville, more remote, more defensible, and far from any memories of trauma. Marshall had taken early retirement from the Army with full benefits, using his savings and disability compensation to create a trust fund that would ensure Grace's financial security through college and beyond. "Daddy, watch this," Grace called, holding up her prosthetic hand. Her physical therapy had progressed to the point where she could grip objects, write, and even play catch with remarkable dexterity. The scars from her cigarette burns had faded to barely visible marks, and her psychological healing had been even more dramatic. Marshall's phone buzzed with a quarterly update from Jake Krause's monitoring service. Brian McGowan was in his 3rd year of an 8-year federal sentence at a maximum security facility in Ohio. He'd been classified as a high-risk inmate after attempting to organize a prison escape and had been placed in permanent solitary confinement. His projected release date had been extended to 2034. Candace was serving her sentence at a women's federal facility in West Virginia. Her parole applications had been denied twice, and prison psychologists had diagnosed her with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits that made rehabilitation unlikely. Her earliest possible release was 2031, assuming perfect behavior and successful completion of mandatory therapy programs. More importantly, both were registered as federal child abuse offenders, which meant permanent monitoring, employment restrictions, and automatic disqualification from any jobs involving children. Even after release, they would be pariahs in any community they tried to join. The legal victory had been total. Marshall's divorce had been finalized with full custody, no visitation rights, and permanent restraining orders. Grace's name had been legally changed to Grace Marshall Wallace, and Marshall had begun adoption proceedings to formalize his sole parental status. Every legal avenue for Brian or Candace to reconnect with Grace had been permanently closed. "Mr. Wallace?" A woman's voice called from the front of the house. Marshall walked around to find Dr. Alice Stewart, a child psychologist from Asheville who'd been working with Grace for the past 6 months. Dr. Stewart was younger than Dr. Dixon but equally skilled, and Grace had formed a strong therapeutic relationship with her. "Dr. Stewart, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I wanted to discuss Grace's progress before our session. She's reached a remarkable milestone. Her trauma responses have decreased to the point where I believe we can reduce our sessions to monthly check-ins." Marshall felt a weight lift from his shoulders. She's really healing? More than healing. She's thriving. Grace is developing into a confident, secure child with strong emotional intelligence and remarkable resilience. The nightmares have stopped, her trust issues have resolved, and she's forming healthy attachments. Dr. Stewart paused, watching Grace play with Atlas in the backyard. "Marshall, I want you to understand how extraordinary this recovery is. Most children who experience systematic abuse carry those wounds for life. Grace's healing is a testament to your dedication, the quality of care she's received, and her own inner strength." "She's an amazing kid," Marshall said softly. "She is. And she has an amazing father." Dr. Stewart turned to face him directly. "Marshall, there's something else I need to discuss with you. Grace has been asking questions about dating and marriage lately." Marshall's expression tightened slightly. "She's 7 years old." "Not for herself," Dr. Stewart laughed. "For you. She's been asking if you'll ever get married again, if she might have a new mommy someday. It's actually a very healthy sign. It means she's secure enough in your relationship to consider expanding the family." The thought of remarriage hadn't seriously crossed Marshall's mind. His entire focus had been on Grace's recovery and ensuring their security. But he had to admit that the idea wasn't entirely unwelcome. Grace deserved to experience healthy family dynamics, and Marshall had room in his life for love again. "What should I tell her?" "The truth. That you're focused on her right now, but someday you might meet someone special who would love both of you. Keep it simple and honest." As Dr. Stewart left, Marshall returned to the backyard where Grace was teaching Atlas to sit and stay. Her commands were confident and clear, her body language showing none of the fearfulness that had characterized her behavior during the early months of recovery. "Daddy, Dr. Alice says Atlas is the smartest dog she's ever met," Grace announced proudly. "Atlas is pretty special," Marshall agreed. "But not as special as his girl." Grace beamed at the compliment, then grew thoughtful. "Daddy, do you think Mommy and Brian are sorry for hurting me?" It was a question Grace asked periodically, and Marshall had learned to answer it honestly, but age-appropriately. "I think they probably are sorry, sweetheart. But being sorry doesn't change what they did, and it doesn't mean they get to be part of our family again." "I know. I just wondered." Grace threw the frisbee for Atlas again. "I'm glad they can't come back. I like our family just the way it is." "Me too, baby girl. Me too." That evening, after Grace had gone to bed, Marshall sat in his home office reviewing the final pieces of his long-term security plan. Jake Krause's firm had established a permanent monitoring system that would track Brian and Candace for the rest of their lives. If either one ever came within 50 miles of Marshall or Grace, he would know immediately. Ralph Best's legal team had created a comprehensive protective structure that included trust funds, educational provisions, and contingency plans for every possible scenario. If something happened to Marshall, Grace would be cared for by carefully vetted guardians who understood her history and were prepared to maintain her security. Derek Schultz had established a network of contacts in law enforcement, federal agencies, and private security that would ensure rapid response to any threats. Marshall's family was protected by layers of legal, technological, and human resources that would be nearly impossible to circumvent. Marshall's phone rang, a call from his sister-in-law Jeanette Park, whom he'd reconnected with after years of minimal contact. Jeanette was a trauma nurse in Charlotte who'd offered to help with Grace's ongoing medical needs. "Marshall, I wanted to give you an update on the support group I mentioned. There are 3 other single fathers in the Charlotte area who've dealt with similar situations, military men whose families were threatened or harmed while they were deployed. Similar how? Child abuse, domestic violence, custody battles with dangerous ex-partners. They've all successfully protected their children and rebuilt their lives. I think you and Grace might benefit from connecting with families who understand what you've been through." The idea appealed to Marshall. Grace needed to see that they weren't alone, that other families had overcome similar challenges and thrived. And Marshall could benefit from the perspectives of men who'd faced comparable battles. "Set up a meeting," Marshall said. "But Jeanette, these men have been thoroughly vetted? Background checks, psychological evaluations, references from multiple sources. These are good men, Marshall. Heroes, actually." After ending the call, Marshall walked through his house, checking security systems and locks, a nightly ritual that had become second nature. Every door, every window, every potential entry point was secured. The safe room was stocked with supplies for a week-long siege. The alarm system was connected to local law enforcement, the FBI, and Jake's rapid response team. Marshall paused outside Grace's bedroom door, listening to her soft breathing. She slept peacefully now, without nightmares or crying spells. Her room was decorated with artwork from her therapy sessions, images of castles and knights, rainbows and butterflies, families of stick figures holding hands under smiling suns. The monsters were gone. The threats had been neutralized. Justice had been served completely and permanently. Grace was safe, healthy, and happy. She was surrounded by people who loved and protected her. She would grow up knowing that her father would move heaven and earth to keep her from harm, and that some battles were worth fighting no matter the cost. Marshall had achieved absolute victory in every sense that mattered. His enemies were imprisoned, his daughter was thriving, and his family was secure for the foreseeable future. But victory came with vigilance. Marshall would never stop watching, never stop preparing, never stop being ready to defend what he'd built. Because the most important lesson he'd learned was simple. Some things are worth any price to protect. And Grace was worth everything. Chapter 8. The Price of Justice. 2 years after the arrests, Marshall received a call that changed everything. Grace was in her 2nd year of elementary school, thriving academically and socially, when Agent Andrea Sampson contacted him with news that sent ice through his veins. "Marshall, I need to meet with you immediately. There's been a development in the McGowan case that we need to discuss in person." 30 minutes later, Agent Sampson sat in Marshall's living room while Grace played upstairs, unaware that their carefully constructed safety might be under threat again. "Brian McGowan is dead," Agent Sampson said without preamble. Marshall felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a small measure of disappointment that he hadn't been the one to ensure Brian would never threaten Grace again. How? Prison fight that got out of hand. Another inmate named Samuel Fowler decided that child abusers needed special attention. Brian lasted about 3 minutes in the fight. And you're here because? Agent Sampson's expression grew grim. Because Candace is claiming that Brian's death wasn't random. She's alleging that you orchestrated it somehow, that you have connections in the federal prison system that allowed you to arrange Brian's murder. Marshall's laugh was genuinely amused. That's quite a conspiracy theory. Do you have any evidence supporting these allegations? None whatsoever. But Candace has been making noise about it to anyone who'll listen. Other inmates, prison administrators, her attorney. She's claiming that if Brian could be killed in prison, she's next. Is she requesting protective custody? She's requesting a transfer to a facility with better security. She's also demanding a federal investigation into your activities and your contacts with former military personnel who might have connections to organized crime. Marshall considered this development carefully. Candace was desperate and running out of options, so she was grasping at any narrative that might improve her situation. Unfortunately, her conspiracy theories weren't entirely implausible to people who didn't know the full truth. Agent Sampson, are you investigating these allegations? We're required to investigate any claims of witness intimidation or conspiracy to commit murder. But between you and me, Candace's credibility is somewhat limited given her conviction for child abuse and fraud. What do you need from me? Complete transparency about your activities since Brian's incarceration. Phone records, financial records, travel history, contacts with former military personnel. We need to demonstrate conclusively that you had no involvement in Brian's death. Marshall nodded. You'll have everything by tomorrow morning. But I should mention that Jake Krause's security firm has been monitoring Brian throughout his incarceration. We can provide detailed records showing that I had no contact with anyone at his facility. That would be helpful. There's one more thing, Marshall. Candace is also claiming that Grace isn't safe with you, that your vigilante activities make you unfit as a parent. She's attempting to get outside advocates involved in demanding a custody review. This was more serious. While Candace had no legal standing to request custody, outside advocacy groups could sometimes generate enough pressure to force child welfare investigations. What kind of advocates? Prison reform groups, women's rights organizations, people who specialize in cases where they believe the system has failed mothers and children. Candace has been telling them that she was coerced into her confession, that you manipulated the evidence, and that Grace is being held by a dangerous veteran with PTSD. Marshall felt familiar anger building in his chest. Even from prison, Candace was trying to hurt Grace by undermining her security and stability. It was exactly the kind of narcissistic manipulation that had enabled Brian's abuse in the first place. Agent Sampson, I assume you're recording this conversation? Yes. Good. Let me be absolutely clear. I had no involvement in Brian McGowan's death. I made no contact with anyone at his facility. I paid no money to anyone to harm him. I made no threats, issued no orders, and took no actions to endanger his life. Marshall paused to let that sink in. However, I will also state clearly that Brian McGowan's death represents no loss to society. He was a child abuser, a predator, and a threat to innocent people. The world is safer without him in it. That's an interesting distinction. It's an honest one. I didn't kill Brian McGowan, but I'm not sorry he's dead. And if Candace wants to waste her time and energy on conspiracy theories instead of acknowledging her own crimes, that's her choice. Agent Sampson closed her notebook. Marshall, off the record, do you think there's any possibility that one of your military contacts might have taken independent action? Marshall considered the question seriously. Jake, Ralph, Derek, and his other friends were certainly capable of arranging something like Brian's death. They were loyal, resourceful, and shared his protective instincts toward Grace. But they were also professionals who understood the importance of legal boundaries. Agent Sampson, the men I served with are patriots who respect the rule of law. They've helped me protect Grace through legal means, surveillance, documentation, security systems. I can't imagine any of them taking illegal action without my knowledge or consent. But you can't rule it out entirely? I can't rule out anything entirely. But I can tell you that if someone did act independently, It wasn't at my request or with my knowledge. After Agent Sampson left, Marshall spent the evening making phone calls to his network. Jake, Ralph, and Derek all denied any involvement in Brian's death, and their denials carried the ring of truth. The consensus was that Brian had simply encountered the wrong person on the wrong day, a common occupational hazard for child abusers in federal prison. That night, Marshall sat on Grace's bed while she practiced reading from a chapter book about a girl detective who solved mysteries. "Daddy, Mrs. Henderson says I'm reading at a 5th grade level even though I'm only in 2nd grade, Grace announced proudly. "That's amazing, sweetheart. You've always been smart." Grace set down her book and looked at Marshall with the direct gaze that always reminded him of her mother, back when Candace had been worth looking at. "Daddy, are you worried about something?" Marshall had learned not to lie to Grace. She was perceptive enough to sense dishonesty, and she deserved the truth in age-appropriate terms. "Some people are asking questions about our family," Marshall said carefully. "They want to make sure you're safe and happy." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about whether Daddy takes good care of you, whether you're happy living here, whether you feel safe." Grace frowned. "That's silly. Of course I'm happy and safe. You're the best daddy in the world. I'm glad you feel that way, baby girl. But if anyone ever asks you those questions, I want you to tell them exactly how you feel. Tell them the truth about our life together." "I will, Daddy. But why would anyone ask those questions?" Marshall chose his words carefully. "Because your biological mother is trying to convince people that she should be allowed to see you again." Grace's expression hardened, an unusual look on a 7-year-old's face, but one that had appeared more frequently when Candace was mentioned. "I don't want to see her, Daddy. She watched while Brian hurt me. She said you were dead. She's not my mommy anymore." "I know, sweetheart. And I promise you won't have to see her unless you want to. But some people think children should always have contact with their biological parents, even when those parents made bad choices." "That's stupid," Grace said with 7-year-old certainty. "Bad parents should lose their kids forever. Good parents like you should keep their kids forever." Marshall smiled at her simple moral clarity. "You're absolutely right. But sometimes we have to prove to other people that we're a good family. How do we prove it? By living the way we live. By being happy, being honest, and showing everyone that you're safe and loved." Grace nodded solemnly. "I can do that. I'm good at showing people that you're the best daddy." As Marshall tucked Grace into bed, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Brian McGowan's death had eliminated one threat permanently, but it had also created new problems by giving Candace a narrative to exploit. She was using his death to paint Marshall as a dangerous vigilante, even though she should be grateful that her former partner would never hurt another child. The next morning, Marshall began the process of providing Agent Sampson with complete documentation of his activities. Phone records, financial statements, travel logs, meeting schedules, everything that would demonstrate his complete lack of involvement in Brian's death. But as he compiled the evidence, Marshall found himself thinking about justice and consequences. Brian McGowan had received exactly what he deserved, whether through random prison violence or divine intervention. His death was a form of justice that the legal system couldn't provide, permanent, irreversible, and absolute. Candace, meanwhile, was learning that actions had consequences that extended far beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. Her attempts to manipulate the system from behind bars were failing because she'd lost all credibility through her own choices. She would serve her full sentence, be released as a registered sex offender, and spend the rest of her life as a pariah. Marshall had achieved something that few people ever managed: complete victory over enemies who had threatened his family. Brian was dead, Candace was imprisoned and discredited, and Grace was safe, happy, and thriving. The price of that victory was eternal vigilance. Marshall would always be watching for new threats, always be prepared to defend what he'd built, always be ready to pay whatever price was necessary to protect his daughter. But it was a price he was willing to pay, because some things were worth everything, and Grace was worth more than everything. Chapter 9, Forever Vigilant. 5 years had passed since Brian McGowan's death in federal prison. Grace was now 12 years old, a confident and intelligent young woman who bore no visible scars from her early trauma. She played violin in the school orchestra, competed in academic decathlons, and had developed into a natural leader among her peers. Marshall stood in the audience of Grace's middle school graduation, watching his daughter receive the valedictorian award. At 12, She was already planning her high school course schedule and talking about college applications. Her prosthetic fingers had been upgraded twice, and she used them with such natural dexterity that most people never noticed they weren't biological. "Mr. Wallace," a voice said behind him. Marshall turned to find Dr. Alice Stewart, Grace's psychologist, who had become a family friend over the years. "Dr. Stewart, I didn't expect to see you here. Grace invited me. She wanted me to see her graduate." Dr. Stewart smiled warmly. "Marshall, I want you to know that in 15 years of pediatric psychology, I've never seen a more complete recovery from severe childhood trauma. Grace is thriving in every measurable way. She's an exceptional kid. She is. But she's also had exceptional support." Dr. Stewart's expression grew more serious. "There's something I wanted to discuss with you. Grace has been asking about her biological mother again." Marshall's jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of questions?" "Developmental questions, mostly. She wants to understand her medical history, her genetic background, that sort of thing. But she's also curious about whether Candace has changed, whether she's genuinely sorry for what happened." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that some questions can only be answered by her when she's older, if she chooses to seek those answers." "But Marshall, I think Grace is emotionally stable enough now to handle some level of truth about her mother." Marshall considered this carefully. He'd been dreading this conversation for years, knowing that eventually Grace would want to understand her origins more completely. "Dr. Stewart, has Grace expressed any desire to see Candace?" "Not to see her, no. But she's expressed curiosity about her. It's natural for adolescents to want to understand their family history, even when that history is painful." Marshall nodded. "I'll think about it." After the graduation ceremony, Marshall and Grace drove home through the mountain roads that had become familiar and comforting over the years. Their house was no longer the fortress it had once been. The security systems remained, but the atmosphere was one of peace rather than vigilance. "Daddy, I've been thinking about something," Grace said as they pulled into their driveway. "What's that, sweetheart?" "I want to know what happened to my biological mother. I know she's in prison, and I know she did bad things, but I want to understand why." Marshall parked the car and turned to face his daughter. At 12, Grace looked remarkably like Candace had at the same age, the same green eyes, the same determined chin, the same intelligence shining in her face. But there was a strength in Grace that Candace had never possessed, a moral clarity that came from overcoming trauma rather than inflicting it. "Grace, that's a complicated question with a complicated answer. I'm not a little kid anymore, Daddy. I can handle complicated." Marshall took a deep breath. "Your biological mother made choices that hurt you very badly. She chose her relationship with Brian over your safety. She chose to participate in your abuse rather than protect you. Those choices had consequences. Is she still in prison?" "Yes. She won't be eligible for release for another 3 years. And after that, she'll be a registered sex offender for the rest of her life. She'll have restrictions on where she can live, where she can work, who she can associate with. She'll be monitored by law enforcement permanently." Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Do you think she's sorry?" Marshall chose his words carefully. "I think she's sorry about the consequences of her choices. Whether she's truly sorry about hurting you, I don't know. And it doesn't matter." "Why doesn't it matter?" "Because being sorry doesn't undo damage. Being sorry doesn't restore trust. Being sorry doesn't make someone safe to be around." Marshall turned to face Grace directly. "Some mistakes are so serious that they can't be forgiven or forgotten." Grace nodded slowly. "Like what Brian did to me. Like what both of them did to you." "Grace, I need you to understand something very important. You don't owe either of them forgiveness. You don't owe them a relationship. You don't owe them anything at all. But what if she really has changed? What if she's genuinely sorry and wants to make amends?" Marshall felt a familiar protective anger rising in his chest. "Then she can carry that burden for the rest of her life. Grace, your safety and happiness are more important than anyone else's redemption." They sat in the car for several more minutes while Grace processed this conversation. Finally, she spoke again. "Daddy, I've decided something." "What's that?" "I don't want to see her or talk to her, not ever. But someday, when I'm older, I might want to write her a letter. Not to forgive her, but to tell her how her choices affected me and how I overcame them." Marshall smiled grimly. "That sounds like something you might want to discuss with Dr. Stewart when you're ready." "I will. But Daddy, I want you to know something else." "What's that, sweetheart?" "You're my real parent. You're the one who protected me, who helped me heal, who made sure I felt safe and loved. Biology doesn't make someone a parent. Love and protection do. Marshall felt his chest tighten with emotion. Grace, you're the most important thing in my life. Everything I've done, everything I'll ever do, is about making sure you're safe and happy. I know, Daddy, and I'm grateful for everything, even the hard parts. Because the hard parts taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, and that some people will always protect the people they love. That evening, Marshall made his weekly call to Jake Krause for security updates. The surveillance network had evolved over the years from active monitoring to passive alert systems, but it remained in place as a permanent safeguard. Any word on Candace? Marshall asked. Nothing significant. She's been a model prisoner. No disciplinary actions. Participated in all mandatory programs. Expressed appropriate remorse in all evaluations. Her parole applications are getting more sympathetic reviews. Timeline for release. Probably 18 months, maybe 2 years. But Marshall, even when she gets out, she'll be under federal supervision for life. GPS monitoring, regular check-ins, employment restrictions, housing limitations. She'll basically be in minimum security prison for the rest of her life. And if she violates any conditions, immediate return to federal custody, no questions asked. One mistake, one boundary violation, one attempt to contact Grace, and she's back behind bars permanently. Marshall felt satisfaction at this news. The legal system had worked exactly as intended, creating consequences that would follow Candace for the rest of her life. Even if she was eventually released, she would never be truly free, never be able to escape the consequences of her choices. Jake, I want to discuss something with you. Grace is getting older, and she's starting to ask questions about her mother. I need to know that if Candace ever tries to make contact, directly or indirectly, we'll know immediately. Already handled. We've got monitoring on all her communications, all her associates, all her family members. If she even thinks about reaching out to Grace, we'll know before she acts on it. After ending the call, Marshall walked through his house, checking locks and security systems out of habit. But the evening routine felt different now, less about protection from immediate threats, more about maintaining a foundation of safety that allowed Grace to thrive. Marshall paused outside Grace's room, where she was reading a book about forensic science. She developed an interest in criminal justice, probably influenced by her own experiences with the legal system. She talked about becoming a prosecutor or a victim's advocate, someone who could help other children who'd experienced what she had. Daddy, Grace called without looking up from her book. Yes, sweetheart. Thank you. For what? For never giving up on me. For making sure the bad people couldn't hurt me anymore. For being the kind of father who protects his family no matter what. Marshall smiled and kissed the top of her head. You never have to thank me for that, Grace. That's what fathers do. Good fathers do. Bad fathers hurt their children or let other people hurt them. That's true. But you don't have to worry about bad fathers anymore. You're stuck with me forever. Grace grinned up at him. Good. I like being stuck with you. As Marshall prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the long journey from that horrible day when he'd found Grace in her bedroom, missing fingers and covered in burns, to this moment when she was a confident, successful, happy young woman. The path had required sacrifices, his military career, his financial security, his sense of safety and normalcy. It had required him to become harder, more ruthless, more calculating than he'd ever imagined possible. It had required him to make enemies and destroy lives without hesitation or remorse. But looking at Grace now, seeing the woman she was becoming, Marshall knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every difficult choice, every legal battle, every moment of vigilance had served a single purpose: protecting the most important person in his world. Brian McGowan was dead. Candace was imprisoned and powerless. Grace was safe, loved, and thriving. The monsters were gone forever, and the princess lived safely in her castle with the knight who would never stop protecting her. Marshall Wallace had achieved something rare in this world: complete victory over enemies who had threatened his family. He had paid whatever price was necessary, done whatever was required, and ensured that justice was absolute and permanent. The war was over. The good guys had won, and Grace would never have to be afraid again. But Marshall would never stop watching, never stop preparing, never stop being ready to defend what he'd built. Because some things were worth eternal vigilance. And Grace was worth everything.